Part 1. English. My husband spent the entire evening pretending I didn't exist. Then the CEO of the company walked straight toward me, stopped in front of my table, and said, "I've been searching for you." The entire ballroom fell silent. I just smiled that I didn't know it yet. But that single sentence was about to change everything. That I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end, and let me know where you're watching from. Sometimes the people who seem invisible are carrying the biggest stories. The evening had started beautifully, at least, that's what I thought. The annual executive gala was the most important event of the year for my husband's company. It was held at a luxury hotel overlooking the Chicago River, with floor-to-ceiling windows, crystal chandeliers, and enough fresh flowers to fill a small garden. My husband, Richard, had spent weeks preparing for it, or perhaps I should say, he spent weeks preparing himself for it. Not once did he ask what I wanted to wear. Not once did he ask if I was excited. At 68 years old, I should have been used to being overlooked. But somehow, that evening felt different. That I stood in front of the mirror. For nearly an hour before we left, I chose a navy blue dress I had owned for years. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy, just elegant. The kind of dress that made me feel like myself. I adjusted a pearl necklace my mother had given me decades ago. I remembered how excited I used to be for events like this. Back then, Richard would stand behind me and tell me I looked beautiful. Back then, he would reach for my hand before we entered a room. Back then, I believed we were partners. The drive to the hotel was unusually quiet. Richard spent most of it checking emails on his phone. The city lights reflected across the windshield. Cars moved slowly through downtown traffic. That I watched people walking along the sidewalks and wondered why I suddenly felt nervous. Maybe it was just age. Maybe it was intuition. Sometimes those two things feel remarkably similar. When we arrived, valet attendants rushed toward the entrance. Guests stepped out of luxury vehicles wearing designer suits and evening gowns. The hotel lobby glowed with warm golden light. Everything looked perfect. Everything looked successful. Everything looked expensive. Richard immediately spotted several executives near the registration desk. His face lit up, not because he saw me, because he saw them. "Stay here for a second," he said. Before I could answer, he was already walking away. I stood alone beside a marble pillar. 1 second became 5 minutes. 5 minutes became 10. Guests continued arriving. Couples entered together. Friends greeted one another. People laughed. People hugged. People belonged. I checked my phone. Nothing. Finally, I found the ballroom entrance and walked inside alone. The room was breathtaking. Hundreds of guests filled the space. A live jazz band played softly near the stage. Servers moved gracefully between tables carrying silver trays. Large screens displayed company achievements from the past year. Everything celebrated success. Everything celebrated recognition. Everyone, it seemed, except me. I found my assigned seat near the back of the room. Not at Richard's table. Not near senior leadership. Not even close. I assumed it had to be a mistake. When Richard finally appeared, I asked quietly, "Are we sitting separately?" He barely looked at me. That's how the seating chart worked out. Then he walked away again. No explanation, no apology, no concern. Just gone. The evening continued. Each time I caught sight of him, he was surrounded by people, laughing, networking, shaking hands. Meanwhile, I sat beside strangers who seemed surprised to learn I was his wife. One woman blinked twice when I introduced myself. "Oh," she said. "I didn't realize Richard was married." I smiled politely, but something inside me tightened. After 43 years of marriage, that sentence hurt more than I wanted to admit. As the evening progressed, I noticed a pattern. Whenever someone approached us together, Richard quickly redirected the conversation. Whenever introductions happened, my name disappeared. Whenever opportunities arose to acknowledge me, he simply moved on. If I weren't standing there, if I were part of the furniture. The realization settled slowly, like a cold draft entering a warm room. My husband wasn't forgetting me, he was hiding me. The thought felt ridiculous, cruel, impossible. Yet every passing minute made it harder to deny. By the time dinner was served, I felt smaller than I had in years. Not because of where I was sitting. Not because of the expensive room. Not because of the successful people around me. Because the one person who should have been proud to stand beside me seemed determined to make sure nobody noticed I existed. I looked down at my untouched plate. I suddenly wasn't hungry. Then I heard movement near my table. Several executives stood up at once. Conversation stopped. Heads turned toward the ballroom entrance, and that's when I saw him. He entered without an entourage, without fanfare. Yet the entire room reacted. People straightened in their chairs, some hurried toward him. Others waited hopefully for a chance to speak. That I expected him to remain near the front of the room. Instead, he scanned the crowd. Once, twice. Then his eyes landed on me. He immediately changed direction. Straight toward my table. Straight toward me. My heart began to race. That I glanced behind me to make sure he wasn't looking at someone else. He wasn't. He stopped directly in front of me, smiled warmly, and said the words that would change the course of the entire evening. "I've been searching for you." Part 2, English. For a moment, I simply stared at him, the CEO, standing in front of my table, looking directly at me. Not past me. Not through me. Me. The ballroom seemed quieter somehow. Or perhaps it was only my mind trying to catch up. "I've been searching for you." His words echoed in my head. I opened my mouth, but no words came out. After spending an entire evening feeling invisible, suddenly becoming the center of attention felt almost unreal. The CEO smiled again. The kind of smile people wear when they finally find someone important. "Margaret Thompson?" he asked. I nodded. His smile widened. "Good. I was hoping you'd be here tonight." Several people at nearby tables had stopped talking. I could feel their eyes moving between us. I could also feel Richard's eyes, somewhere across the room. Watching, confused, concerned. For the first time that evening, he was paying attention to me. The irony wasn't lost on me. The CEO pulled out a chair and sat down. Not at the executive table. Not near the staged my table, the forgotten table. The table nobody important was supposed to notice. I glanced around the ballroom. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above us. Wine glasses reflected golden light. Soft music drifted through the room. Everything looked exactly the same. Yet somehow everything had changed. The CEO asked me a few simple questions. How had I been? Was I enjoying retirement? Did I still live in Naperville? Normal questions, polite questions, but there was something unusual about them. He already seemed to know the answers. Yes, we talked. My thoughts drifted backward, back to another time. Another version of my life. A version most people in this room had never seen. There was a time when Richard and I built everything together. Not just our marriage, our future, our dreams. When we were young, we couldn't afford much. Our first apartment was barely 600 square feet. The kitchen was so small that only one person could stand in it at a time. The heating system failed every winter. The roof leaked when it rained. Yet somehow those were some of the happiest years of my life. Every evening, Richard would come home carrying folders filled with ideas, business plans, marketing concepts, financial projections. He would spread them across our tiny kitchen table. Then we'd sit together for hours, talking, planning, dreaming, sometimes until 2 in the morning. Back then, he always asked for my opinion. Every idea mattered. Every concern mattered. And somehow, so did I. I remembered one particular night. Richard had been preparing for an important presentation. A presentation that could determine the future of his career. He was exhausted, frustrated, ready to give up. I stayed awake with him until sunrise, reading documents, making notes, helping him organize his thoughts. The next week, he delivered the presentation successfully. Everyone praised him. Everyone congratulated him. And I was genuinely happy for him, because back then, his success felt like our success. I never needed recognition. I never wanted applause. I only wanted partnership. Somewhere along the way, that changed. Not overnight. Not all at once. Small things happened first. Richard stopped asking my opinion. Then he stopped sharing details. Then he stopped mentioning my contributions altogether. Years passed. His career grew. His reputation grew. His confidence grew. And somehow, my place beside him grew smaller. First, I blamed myself. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe this was simply what happened after 40 years of marriage. Maybe people naturally drifted apart. But sitting in that ballroom, I wasn't so sure anymore. The CEO continued speaking with genuine warmth. Meanwhile, more executives had begun looking in our direction. I noticed whispers, curious expressions, confused glances. Nobody understood why the CEO was spending so much time at the least important table in the room. Neither did I. Not yet. But I had a feeling the answer was coming. And whatever that answer was, it seemed to make Richard increasingly uncomfortable. For the first time all evening, I saw uncertainty in my husband's eyes, and that alone told me something important. The story everyone believed about our lives was not the whole story, not even close. Part 3. English. The CEO remained at my table for nearly 20 minutes. That alone seemed to make half the ballroom uncomfortable that I could see it in their faces. People kept glancing in our direction, then looking away when they realized I noticed. The conversations around us had changed. The room was still filled with laughter, still filled with music, still filled with polished smiles. But underneath it all, something had shifted. Curiosity. People wanted answers. Frankly, so did I. The CEO spoke calmly, never raising his voice, never trying to impress anyone. Yet every word carried weight. "How long has it been since we last met?" he asked. That I thought for a moment. "Almost 15 years. He nodded slowly. "That's what I thought. 15 years. Hearing the number spoken aloud felt strange. An entire chapter of my life gone. I remembered that period clearly. Back when Richard's company had been struggling. Back when success wasn't guaranteed. Back when every dollar mattered. The CEO smiled as though he were revisiting the same memories. "You saved us a great deal of trouble back then." I blinked. "I'm not sure I'd put it that way." "Oh, I would." His answer came immediately, and that answer made my stomach tighten, because suddenly I realized he remembered things Richard never mentioned anymore. Things Richard seemed determined to erase. Before I could respond, another executive approached our table, then another, and another. Each greeted the CEO first. Then, surprisingly, they greeted me. Not out of politeness. Out of recognition. One gray-haired gentleman stared at me for several seconds before smiling. "Margaret Thompson." I nodded. "I thought that was you." The way he said it made me uneasy. Not because he was rude, because he sounded genuinely pleased. As if he had found someone important. The feeling was unfamiliar. For years, I had become accustomed to being overlooked, especially in rooms like this, especially beside Richard. Across the ballroom, I noticed my husband speaking with several board members, but his attention wasn't on them. It was on me. Every few minutes, his eyes drifted toward our table. His smile looked forced. Now, tight, uncomfortable, almost nervous. I had not seen Richard nervous in years. That concerned me more than it should have, because nervous people are usually protecting something. Or hiding something. The CEO eventually leaned back in his chair. For the first time all evening, he looked thoughtful. "Richard never talks about those days anymore, does he?" The question landed heavily between us. I chose my words carefully. "Not really." The CEO nodded. Though my answer confirmed something he already suspected. A silence followed. Not awkward, just meaningful. The kind of silence that carries unfinished truths. I could feel them sitting there between us, waiting. Nearby, waiters began serving dessert. The band transitioned into softer music. Outside the enormous windows, Chicago's skyline shimmered against the night sky. The city looked beautiful, steady, certain. Meanwhile, inside me, uncertainty continued growing. I had spent most of the evening believing I was invisible. Now I wasn't so sure, because the more attention I received, the more uncomfortable Richard became, and that contradiction bothered me. The CEO checked his watch, then looked directly at me. "There's something I've wanted to ask you for a very long time." My pulse quickened. His tone had changed, the warmth remained. But something else had entered his voice, seriousness. Whatever he was about to say mattered a great deal. That exact moment, I noticed Richard was walking quickly toward the table with a smile on his face. At least, that's how it appeared on the outside. But after 43 years of living together, I knew the difference very well. It wasn't confidence. It was anxiety. He was someone trying to control the situation. "Is everything all right here?" he asked softly, but his eyes kept shifting between me and the CEO. "The CEO is David." Quickly, too quickly, almost as if he had been waiting for an opportunity to interrupt. The CEO stood and shook his hand. "Richard." And for a brief second, an expression crossed his face, recognition, understanding, perhaps even disappointment. Then he looked back at me and smiled. The kind of smile someone gives before revealing a truth that can no longer stay hidden. Part 4. English. The two men exchanged polite smiles. Neither looked particularly relaxed. For a moment, nobody spoke. The tension settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Invisible, but impossible to ignore. Richard finally laughed a little too loudly. "I see you found my wife." My wife .it was the first time that entire evening he had publicly acknowledged who I was. The realization stung more than I expected. David glanced at me before returning his attention to Richard. Yes, he said calmly. I've been hoping to speak with Margaret for years. Years, not months, not weeks. Years. Richard's smile tightened. I saw it happen, just for a second. Then it disappeared. Well, Richard replied, she's mostly stayed out of the business world. The CEO's expression changed. Only slightly, but enough. Has she? The question sounded innocent. It wasn't that I knew it. Richard knew it. The silence that followed confirmed it. That I suddenly felt as though I had walked into the middle of a conversation that had started long before I arrived, at a conversation everyone understood except me. Nearby, guests continued watching. Some pretended not to. Others didn't bother pretending at all. The room had become fascinated by our table. And for the first time in years, I wasn't sitting quietly in someone else's shadow. That I was at the center of the story. The thought felt uncomfortable, but also strangely freeing. David sat back down. Richard remained standing. That alone seemed significant. One man appeared settled. The other appeared restless. Then David looked directly at me. Do you remember the Henderson proposal? The name hit me immediately. Of course I remembered. How could I forget? 15 years earlier, Richard's company had been fighting for survival. One failed contract could have ended everything. The Henderson proposal had been one of the largest opportunities they had ever received. For weeks, our dining room had been covered with documents, charts, budgets, research reports. Draft after draft after draft, I remembered every detail. Because I had helped create much of it, I opened my mouth slowly. Yes. David smiled. I thought you would. Across the table, Richard looked as though he wanted the subject changed. Immediately, David continued. You solved a problem that none of us could solve. I stared at him. Surely he was exaggerating. That I had only done what seemed obvious at the time. That I remembered sitting at our kitchen table late one night, reading through pages of financial projections. Something wasn't working. The numbers didn't make sense. The strategy was flawed. That I pointed it out. Then I suggested an alternative, that a different approach, that a different structure. Richard had listened. The proposal was revised. The client accepted it. The company survived. That was all. Or so I thought. David shook his head as if reading my thoughts. No, Margaret. His voice was gentle. That proposal changed everything. My heart began beating faster. Not because of what he said. Because of what Richard wasn't saying. He wasn't correcting him. He wasn't laughing it off. He wasn't denying it. He simply stood there, silent. For years, I had convinced myself that my contributions were small, that they weren't important, that I had merely supported my husband from the background. But now a different possibility was beginning to emerge. What if that wasn't true? What if the story I had believed for 15 years wasn't the real story at all? Richard shifted uncomfortably. David, perhaps this isn't the right place. It is exactly the right place. David interrupted him politely. The ballroom seemed quieter again. Even the music felt distant. I could sense something approaching. Something important, that a truth, that a revelation, a missing piece of my own life. And judging by the look on Richard's face, he was terrified that I was about to hear it. Part 5. English. Nobody at our table spoke for several seconds. The silence felt unusually loud. Richard remained standing. David remained seated. And I sat between them, trying to understand why my entire life suddenly felt different. David folded his hands calmly. Margaret, he said, do you know why I wanted to find you tonight? I shook my head. Honestly, I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Not because I was afraid of the answer, because I was afraid of what it might change. For decades, I had accepted a simple version of my life. Richard built a successful career. That I supported him. That was the story. That it was neat, comfortable, familiar. But tonight, that story was beginning to crack. David glanced toward the ballroom before speaking again. 15 years ago, our board faced a decision. I listened carefully. So did Richard's company. He paused. Most people in this room believe the company survived because of one presentation. I remembered that presentation. Everyone did. That it had become part of company history. The story was told every year. The ambitious executive, the brilliant strategy, the major breakthrough. And at the center of that story stood Richard. David slowly shook his head. That's not what happened. A strange feeling settled in my chest. That I looked toward Richard. His jaw tightened, but he said nothing. David continued. The presentation was important. Then he looked directly at me. But the strategy wasn't Richard's. My heart skipped a beat. I thought I had misunderstood. Surely he couldn't mean, it was yours. The words landed harder than I expected. Not because I believed them, because I had spent years convincing myself they weren't true. Immediately, memories began returning. Long nights, stacks of paperwork, spreadsheets spread across our dining room table. Legal pads filled with handwritten notes that I remembered identifying problems nobody else seemed to notice. I remembered suggesting alternatives, that I remembered challenging assumptions. And I remembered Richard listening. Back then, I thought that was what marriage was. Two people solving problems together, that I never imagined anyone would separate his success from my contribution. David leaned forward slightly. Do you remember the restructuring proposal? I nodded slowly. That proposal had taken weeks, perhaps months. The company had been losing money. Clients were leaving. Morale was low. Everyone seemed focused on the wrong problem. That I had seen something different, not because I was smarter, because I was looking from a different angle. One evening, I sketched out a completely different framework, a different way to organize operations, that a different approach to client retention, that a different path forward. Richard reviewed it, then incorporated nearly every major recommendation that I had forgotten or maybe I had chosen to forget. David hadn't. The board rejected 3 previous solutions. His voice remained calm. Yours was the first one that worked. Nearby conversations had started fading. More people were listening now. I could feel it, a growing circle of attention, a growing circle of witnesses. For years, I had sat quietly at events like this. Tonight felt different. Tonight people were hearing my name. Not as someone's wife, as myself. The realization was strangely emotional. Not exciting. Not triumphant. Just emotional. Because there is a certain sadness that comes from discovering how long you've been invisible. David looked around the room, then back at me. You never received credit. It wasn't a question. It was a fact. I lowered my eyes briefly. No. His expression softened. I always wondered why. Across the table, Richard finally spoke. His voice sounded strained. Margaret never cared about recognition. David nodded. That's true. Then his tone changed. But caring about recognition and being denied recognition are 2 very different things. Nobody responded, because nobody could. The statement hung in the air, simple, accurate, impossible to dismiss. For the first time all evening, I noticed several board members watching Richard instead of me. Their expressions had changed, questions had appeared, doubt had appeared, and Richard knew it. That I could see it. The story he had controlled for years was beginning to slip away. Not because I was exposing him. Not because I was seeking revenge. Because someone else had decided the truth mattered. David checked the stage where the evening's awards ceremony would soon begin. Then he looked back at me. Margaret, he said quietly, there is something else you deserve to know. The way he said it made my pulse quicken, because whatever came next was clearly bigger than a single proposal. Bigger than a single idea. Bigger than one forgotten contribution. And judging by the look on Richard's face, it was the secret he had hoped would remain buried forever. There is something else you deserve to know. David's words lingered in the air. For a moment, nobody moved. The ballroom continued around us. Glasses clinked. Waiters crossed the room. Music floated softly from the stage. Yet everything at our table felt suspended in time. I looked at Richard. He was no longer pretending to be comfortable. His shoulders were stiff. His expression carefully controlled. But I could see it. The fear. Not panic. Not yet. But fear. David turned his attention back to me. Margaret, do you remember attending the Strategic Leadership Summit in Denver? I frowned slightly. The memory came back slowly. Yes. It had been nearly 14 years ago. Richard had been invited to speak. At the time, his company was finally gaining recognition. It was one of the most important opportunities of his career. I remembered traveling with him. I remembered sitting quietly in conference rooms, listening, observing, taking notes. David nodded. Do you remember the emergency meeting the night before his presentation? I did. Very clearly. The original proposal had fallen apart. Several key assumptions had proven incorrect. Senior leaders were worried. Investors were nervous. The atmosphere had been tense. I remembered Richard returning to the hotel frustrated and exhausted. He had barely spoken during dinner. Later that evening, we sat together in the hotel lounge. Most guests had already gone to bed. Only a few lamps remained lit. For hours, we reviewed documents together. Page after page. Problem after problem. Eventually, I suggested a completely different approach. Not because I thought I knew better. Simply because I saw the situation differently. I remembered sketching ideas on a legal pad. Arrows. Notes. Questions. Alternative solutions. Richard listened. Then he began rewriting his presentation. David smiled. As I recall, that presentation received a standing ovation. Several executives nearby nodded. They remembered it too. Of course they did. The presentation had become part of company legend. People still talked about it. Richard looked away. David continued. What most people don't know is that the presentation they applauded wasn't the one Richard originally planned to give. Silence. Absolute silence. Even I felt my heart beating faster. David wasn't accusing anyone. His tone remained calm, matter of fact, which somehow made it even more powerful. It was built from the framework Margaret developed that night. I lowered my eyes. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to minimize it, to say it wasn't important. But another part of me was becoming tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of shrinking my own memories. Tired of rewriting my own history to make everyone else comfortable. David wasn't revealing anything I didn't already know. He was simply saying it out loud. For years, I had quietly edited myself out of the story. Tonight, someone else was putting me back in. I noticed several people exchanging glances. Board members, senior executives, people who had spent years believing a different version of events. No one interrupted. No one challenged him. Because many of them had been there. Many of them remembered. David looked around the room. Then back at me. Margaret, there are dozens of people in this company who still remember your contributions. The statement caught me off guard. Dozens? I hadn't expected that. In my mind, those years had faded away long ago. Apparently, they hadn't faded for everyone. A woman from another table approached quietly. I recognized her after a moment. Linda, a former vice president. Retired now. She smiled warmly. I've wanted to thank you for years. I stared at her. For what? She laughed softly. For helping save my department. I blinked. I barely remembered the situation. She did. And suddenly another realization struck me. Many of the moments I considered small had mattered to other people. Perhaps much more than I ever understood. Across the table, Richard remained silent. That silence was becoming impossible to ignore. Because every news story confirmed the same thing. These weren't isolated incidents. These weren't lucky guesses. These weren't minor contributions. They formed a pattern, a history, a legacy, one that had somehow disappeared from public memory, or perhaps had been pushed there. David finally leaned closer. His voice lowered slightly. What I'm telling you tonight is only part of it. A chill ran through me. Only part of it. I wasn't sure whether I wanted to hear the rest. Then I saw Richard close his eyes briefly, just for a second, as if preparing himself for something inevitable. And in that moment, I knew. The biggest secret had not yet been revealed. Only part of it. David's words stayed with me. I sat quietly as the ballroom buzzed around us. Only part of it. How much more was there? And why had nobody ever told me? For years, I had viewed my life through a very simple lens. Richard was the leader. I was the supporter. Richard made the decisions. I helped when needed. That was the arrangement. Or at least, that was what I believed. Now I wasn't so sure. David stood and greeted another executive who had approached our table. A woman named Karen. She had served on the board years earlier. I vaguely remembered meeting her once or twice. To my surprise, her face lit up when she saw me. Margaret. She immediately reached for my hand. I can't believe it's really you. I smiled politely. I wasn't sure what to say anymore. Everything felt unfamiliar. Karen laughed softly. You probably don't remember this. I already knew what was coming. Another story. Another piece of a past I had dismissed. She continued. The client retention program. The memory surfaced almost instantly. Not because it had been important to me. Because I had completely forgotten it. Years ago, Richard had been struggling with customer turnover. Several major accounts had left. The company was losing momentum. One weekend, I spent hours reviewing feedback reports. Patterns began appearing. Customers weren't leaving because of price. They were leaving because they felt ignored. I had suggested a completely different communication model. More direct contact. More accountability. More follow-up. Simple ideas. At least they seemed simple to me. Karen smiled. That program became the foundation for everything that followed. I blinked. Again. The same feeling. The same disbelief. The same uncomfortable realization. Things I considered small had apparently changed much more than I ever understood. One story became two. Two became three. Three became five. As the evening continued, more people approached. Some were retired. Some still worked for the company. Each carried a memory. Each remembered something I had forgotten. A conversation. A solution. A recommendation. A meeting. A crisis. Again and again, the stories followed the same pattern. Richard faced a problem. We discussed it together. An idea emerged. The company benefited. Years later, only one name remained attached to the outcome. Richard's. Never mind. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Honestly, I felt something closer to grief. Because I was beginning to understand what had been lost. Not money. Not status. Not awards. Something more personal. Recognition. Identity. History. David eventually returned to his seat. His expression remained calm. But I could tell he had been watching my reactions carefully. I know this is a lot. I nodded. It is. For the first time all evening, my voice sounded uncertain. Not because I doubted what I was hearing. Because I was struggling to reconcile it with everything I had believed. David leaned forward. Margaret, may I ask you something? Of course. Why did you stop? The question surprised me. Stop what? Contributing. I stared at him. I had never thought about it that way. Why had I stopped? The answer came slowly. Not in words. In memories. I remembered Richard gradually sharing less. I remembered being excluded from meetings. I remembered ideas being dismissed more quickly. I remembered hearing phrases like, don't worry about it. I've got it handled. Things are different now. One by one, doors had quietly closed. And eventually, I stopped knocking. The realization hit harder than I expected. No single moment had pushed me out. There had been no argument. No confrontation. No announcement. Just a slow erosion. Year after year. Until I barely recognized the place I once held. The CEO seemed to understand. He nodded gently. I suspected as much. Across the table, Richard remained silent. But the silence no longer protected him. In fact, it was beginning to speak louder than words. Several people nearby were watching him now. Not with admiration. With questions. With curiosity. Perhaps even with disappointment. Then the CEO glanced toward the stage. The evening's awards ceremony was about to begin. Employees and executives were taking their seats. The lights began dimming. A host stepped toward the microphone. The CEO stood slowly. Then he looked directly at me. Margaret. His voice was quiet, but serious. There is one final thing everyone in this room deserves to know. My heart skipped. Because something told me this wasn't another story. This wasn't another forgotten contribution. This was the truth Richard had been trying to keep buried. And in just a few minutes, it was about to become public. The ballroom lights dimmed. Conversations faded. Guests returned to their seats. At the front of the room, the master of ceremonies stepped onto the stage and welcomed everyone to the awards portion of the evening. Normally, this was Richard's favorite part of the night. Recognition. Achievement. Public admiration. For years, I had watched him sit proudly during moments like this. Accepting applause. Accepting praise. Accepting credit. Tonight felt different. Tonight, he looked distracted. The host began announcing company milestones. Photos appeared on the large screens. Executives smiled as familiar accomplishments were mentioned. The audience applauded politely. But my attention kept drifting toward Richard. He wasn't watching the stage. He wasn't listening to the speeches. He was watching David. Waiting. Almost bracing himself. Beside me, David remained calm. Composed. Patient. As though he already knew exactly how the evening would end. After several awards were presented, the host smiled and glanced toward David. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue, our David has requested a few minutes to recognize someone very special. Polite applause filled the room. Nothing unusual. At least not yet. David stood. Immediately, the room became quieter. He walked toward the stage. Steady. Confident. Without notes. Without preparation. As though he intended to speak from memory. My stomach tightened. Something was coming. I could feel it. David reached the podium. For a moment, he looked across the ballroom. Then he smiled. I've attended many of these events. Soft laughter rippled through the audience. And over the years, I've had the privilege of recognizing extraordinary people. He paused. But tonight, I'd like to correct an oversight. The room fell silent. Every eye focused on the stage. Even the servers stopped moving. David continued. Some contributions are visible. Others happen quietly. behind closed doors, without titles, without awards. His voice remained calm, yet every word seemed directed somewhere very specific. I felt my pulse quicken. David looked toward my table, toward me, and everyone followed his gaze. Hundreds of faces turned in my direction. For the first time in years, I wanted to disappear. Yet another part of me wanted to stay exactly where I was. David smiled. Many people in this room know Richard Thompson. Applause broke out immediately. Richard forced a smile. David waited, then continued. What fewer people know is that some of the most important ideas associated with his success originated elsewhere. The room became still, completely still. No one moved. No one spoke. Across the ballroom, I saw confusion spreading. Questions, curiosity, shock. David continued. For years, I assumed everyone knew. A brief pause. Apparently, they didn't. Richard's face had gone pale. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough for someone who had known him for 43 years to notice. David turned slightly, looking directly toward my table. Margaret Thompson. Hearing my name through the ballroom speakers felt surreal. My heart pounded. I had no idea what to do. David smiled warmly. Would you please stand? 100 thoughts raced through my mind. I didn't want attention. I never had. But refusing would only make things worse. Slowly I stood. A spotlight shifted, landing directly on me. Gasps echoed softly around the room. Some people recognized me now. Others were seeing me for the first time. David waited until the room settled. Then he spoke words I never expected to hear. Many of the strategies that shaped this company's future began with Margaret. Silence. Then more silence. Not disbelief. Absorption. People processing what they had just heard. David continued listing examples. The Henderson proposal. The restructuring framework. The client retention program. The Denver presentation. One after another. Each story connected to another. Each memory building a larger picture. A picture I had never been allowed to see. Because nobody had ever shown it to me. I looked toward Richard. He wasn't looking at me. He was staring at the floor. And for the first time all evening, I realized something. The room no longer saw him as the only architect of the company's success. They were beginning to see me too. And once people see the truth, it becomes very difficult to hide it again. Part 9, English. For several long seconds, nobody applauded. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The ballroom sat in complete silence. Not because people disagreed. Because they were processing what they had just heard. I remained standing beside my table. The spotlight still rested on me. Part of me wanted to sit down. Part of me wanted to leave. But another part of me stood perfectly still. Listening. Watching. Trying to understand how my life had suddenly become the center of attention. David remained at the podium. Calm. Patient. Allowing the room to absorb the truth. Finally, someone began clapping. One person. Then another. Then 3. Then 10. Within moments, the entire ballroom erupted into applause. The sound seemed endless. People rose from their seats. Not all at once, but steadily. Table after table. Row after row. Until much of the room was standing. Applauding. Looking toward me. I felt my throat tighten. Not because of the attention. Because of what it represented. For years, I had told myself recognition didn't matter. Tonight, I realized that wasn't entirely true. Recognition wasn't about ego. It was about being seen. Being acknowledged. Being remembered. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt visible. The applause finally faded. David smiled warmly. Then he continued. Margaret never asked for credit. The room became quiet again. But that doesn't mean credit wasn't deserved. Several heads nodded throughout the ballroom. I noticed executives exchanging looks. Board members whispering quietly. People were connecting pieces. Revisiting old memories. Reconsidering old assumptions. The story they had believed for years was changing in real time. And not everyone seemed comfortable with that. Especially Richard. I glanced toward him. His face remained composed. But I knew him too well. The small tightening around his eyes. The rigid posture. The forced smile. He was struggling. Not with what David was saying. With the fact that people were listening. David stepped away from the podium. Then something unexpected happened. Several former executives approached the microphone. One after another. Unplanned. Unscripted. The first was Karen. She smiled toward me. I owe part of my career to Margaret. A ripple moved through the audience. Then came Linda. The best advice I ever received came from Margaret Thompson. More murmurs. More surprise. Then another executive. then another, each carrying a story, each adding another layer, another memory, another example. By now, the room no longer questioned whether I had contributed. The only question was how much. And judging by the growing reactions around me, the answer appeared to be far more than anyone had realized. I saw several younger employees taking notes, others searching old memories. Some looked toward Richard, others looked toward me. But the balance had shifted completely. For decades, I had entered rooms as Richard's wife. Tonight, Richard was becoming Margaret's husband. The thought startled me, not because I wanted power, because I had never expected perspective to change so quickly. David eventually returned to the stage. The applause settled. Then he spoke again. His next words struck the room even harder. There's one final reason I wanted to recognize Margaret tonight. The ballroom grew silent. I noticed Richard lower his head slightly, almost as though he already knew what was coming. David looked toward him briefly, then back to the audience. Many people assume leadership is about visibility. A pause. I disagree. Another pause. Leadership is often about the person whose name never appears on the presentation. Nobody moved. Nobody interrupted. The room was completely his. And then he said the sentence that changed everything. The company nearly named Margaret as an honorary strategic advisor 15 years ago. Gasps echoed across the ballroom. My heart stopped. I had never heard that before. Never. Not once. I turned toward Richard instinctively. His face told me everything. He had known. The realization hit harder than anything else that evening. Not because of the title, not because of the honor, but because someone had made sure I never found out. And suddenly, I understood why Richard looked so afraid. The truth wasn't simply being revealed. It was catching up with him. The ballroom remained silent. Not shocked anymore. Just quiet. The kind of quiet that follows a truth people can no longer ignore. I sat down slowly. My hands rested in my lap. My heart was still racing. 15 years. For 15 years, an entire chapter of my life had existed without me knowing the full story. The honorary advisor position, the recognition, the conversations that had apparently happened behind closed doors. I had known nothing about any of it. Not because nobody remembered, not because nobody cared, because nobody had told me, or perhaps because someone had chosen not to. David stood calmly on stage. He wasn't angry. He wasn't exposing anyone. He wasn't trying to humiliate Richard. That was what made everything so powerful. He was simply telling the truth. And the truth was doing all the work by itself. The audience understood that. I understood that. Most importantly, Richard understood that. David looked across the room. Then he smiled. Margaret, would you join me on stage for a moment? A few months earlier, the idea would have terrified me. Tonight, it felt strangely natural. I stood. The spotlight followed me. The room watched quietly. As I walked toward the stage, something unexpected happened. People began stepping aside. Not dramatically, not ceremonially, just naturally, respectfully, creating space. For me, the woman who had spent most of the evening hidden near the back wall. The contrast wasn't lost on me. A few hours ago, I had entered the ballroom feeling invisible. Now hundreds of people were watching me cross it. Not because of pity, not because of sympathy, because they wanted to know who I really was. When I reached the stage, the CEO offered his hand. I accepted it. The audience applauded again. This time the applause felt different. Warmer. Personal. David waited for the room to settle. Then he turned toward me. Margaret, do you know why we considered naming you an honorary advisor? I shook my head. No. The answer felt almost embarrassing. How could I know something nobody had ever told me? David smiled sadly. Because several members of the board believed you were one of the most insightful strategic minds we'd ever encountered. A murmur moved through the audience. I stared at him. I genuinely didn't know what to say. Not because I disagreed. Because nobody had ever described me that way before. Not publicly. Not privately. Not even Richard. Especially not Richard. David continued. The proposal ultimately failed. A pause. We were informed you weren't interested. The room froze. Every muscle in my body tightened. I blinked. Once. Twice. Surely I had heard him incorrectly. We were told, David repeated gently, that you preferred to stay completely removed from company affairs. The audience became perfectly still. I felt the blood drain from my face. Because I had never said that. Not once. Not ever. The realization arrived instantly. Sharp. Clear. Unavoidable. Someone had answered on my behalf. Someone had made that decision for me. I didn't need to ask who. The entire room already knew. Slowly, I turned my head. Richard sat motionless at his table. He wasn't looking at me. He wasn't looking at anyone. He was staring down at his folded hands. And suddenly, every missing piece fell into place. The meetings I was never invited to. The opportunities one never heard about. The recognition that never arrived. The doors that quietly closed. Perhaps they had never closed on their own. Perhaps someone had been closing them, one by one, year after year. Not because I lacked ability. Not because I lacked interest. But because my success threatened someone else's spotlight. The thought should have made me angry. Oddly enough, it didn't. What I felt was sadness. Deep sadness. For both of us. Because in protecting his image, Richard had slowly destroyed something much more valuable. Trust. David looked at me carefully, as if wondering how I would react. The audience seemed to wonder the same thing. The room waited. For anger. For confrontation. For revenge. Instead, I simply smiled. A small smile. A tired smile. Then I leaned toward the microphone. And for the first time all evening, I spoke. Thank you. That was all. 2 simple words. Yet somehow they changed the room. Because everyone suddenly realized something. I wasn't there to settle scores. I wasn't there to embarrass anyone. I was there to finally reclaim my own name. And sometimes, that is far more powerful. Thank you. 2 simple words. Then I stepped away from the microphone. The room remained silent. Not uncomfortable. Respectful. The kind of silence people give when they have just witnessed something important. I returned the microphone to the CEO. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he smiled. Not the smile of a corporate executive. The smile of someone relieved that a long overdue truth had finally reached the surface. The audience applauded once more. Gentler this time. Warmer. I could feel the difference. Earlier in the evening, people had looked at me with curiosity. Now they looked at me with respect. It was a strange feeling. Not because I wanted attention, but because I had spent so many years expecting none. The CEO turned back toward the audience. I think we've taken enough of Margaret's evening. Soft laughter spread through the ballroom. Then he added one final sentence. Some people change a company from the front of the room. He paused. Others change it from the kitchen table. The applause returned immediately. Longer this time. Stronger. I felt my eyes sting. Not from sadness. Not exactly. It was something more complicated. The feeling of finally being understood. After decades of silence. The CEO thanked everyone and stepped away from the podium. The ceremony resumed. Awards were presented. Photos appeared on screens. Names were announced. But the energy in the room had changed. Completely. People no longer passed my table without noticing me. They stopped. They spoke. They introduced themselves. Some wanted to share memories. Others simply wanted to shake my hand. Again and again, I heard the same phrase. We had no idea. Neither had I. That was the strange part. The person who understood my contributions least may have been me. Because for years, I had accepted the version of the story I had been given. I glanced toward Richard several times. He remained quiet. Much quieter than usual. Several board members approached him. The conversations appeared polite. Professional. But something was different. The dynamic had shifted. For years, people listened to Richard because of what they believed he had accomplished. Now they were reassessing those accomplishments, not erasing them, not denying them, simply seeing the full picture. For perhaps the first time. Near the end of the evening, I stepped outside onto the terrace overlooking the Chicago skyline. The cool night air felt refreshing. The city lights stretched endlessly into the distance. For a few minutes, I stood alone, thinking, remembering, mourning things I hadn't realized I'd lost. Then I heard footsteps behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I already knew who it was. Richard. He stopped several feet away. Neither of us spoke immediately. The sounds of the ballroom drifted through the open doors behind us. Finally, he broke the silence. I never expected this. His voice sounded older somehow. Tired. I looked out across the city. Neither did I. Another silence followed. Long, heavy. Then he spoke again. I thought I was protecting everything we built. The words hung in the air. Everything we built. Not everything I built. Everything we built. Perhaps that was the first completely honest thing he had said all evening. I nodded slowly. Maybe. Richard lowered his eyes. But somewhere along the way, he stopped, unable to finish. I turned toward him. For the first time all night, he looked vulnerable. Not powerful. Not successful. Not admired. Just human. A man facing the consequences of choices made years ago. I should have told you. The sentence came quietly, almost as a whisper. I studied his face. And surprisingly, I believed him. Not because the apology fixed anything, because it sounded genuine. The problem was that some truths arrive years too late. The skyline reflected in the glass around us. Neither of us moved. Finally, Richard spoke once more. I don't know how to make this right. I thought about that for a long moment. Then I gave the only honest answer I had. You can't change the past. Richard nodded. Slowly, painfully, because he knew I was right. But as I looked back through the ballroom windows, I realized something else. For the first time in years, I wasn't looking backward. I was looking forward. And that changed everything. You can't change the past. Richard nodded. Neither of us spoke after that. The city lights stretched across the Chicago skyline. Silent, steady, unaffected by the drama that had unfolded inside the ballroom. For a moment, I felt strangely calm. Not because everything had been resolved. Because it hadn't. Not because the hurt had disappeared. Because it hadn't. Some wounds take years to heal. Some never heal completely. But something had changed. For the first time in a very long time, I was no longer questioning my own worth. And that mattered more than I could explain. Eventually, Richard returned inside. I stayed on the terrace a little longer. Alone. The cool night air felt different now. Lighter. As if I had spent years carrying a weight I never realized was there. A weight made of silence. A weight made of forgotten contributions. A weight made of believing I was less important than I truly was. And tonight, that weight was finally gone. Not because other people had praised me. Not because a CEO had spoken my name. Because I had finally accepted the truth for myself. I mattered. I always had. The recognition from others was meaningful. But the recognition from myself was life-changing. A few minutes later, I returned to the ballroom. People continued approaching me. Some wanted photographs. Others wanted conversations. Several board members asked for my contact information. One even joked that I should attend future strategy meetings. Everyone laughed, including me. Yet for the first time, the idea didn't seem impossible. The evening eventually came to an end. Guests gathered their coats. Goodbyes filled the room. Cars lined up outside the hotel entrance. As people departed, many stopped to shake my hand. Not because they felt sorry for me. Not because they were being polite. Because they respected me. The difference was enormous. When Richard and I finally walked toward the exit, something unexpected happened. The CEO stopped us. He smiled warmly, then handed me a small envelope. Open it tomorrow, he said. I laughed. Why tomorrow? Because tonight has already been emotional enough. His answer made me smile. I thanked him and slipped the envelope into my purse. The drive home was quiet. Not hostile. Not angry. Just quiet. There were too many thoughts for either of us to organize. Too many truths finally sitting in the open. When we reached home, Richard helped me out of the car. A small gesture. Simple. Ordinary. Yet somehow different. As if years of certainty had been replaced by reflection. Before going inside, he looked at me. I am sorry. The words were sincere. I could hear that. And perhaps for the first time, he wasn't speaking as a CEO. Or as a successful businessman. He was speaking as a husband. I nodded. Thank you. Nothing more needed to be said. The next morning, I sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee. The same table where so many ideas had been born. The same table where I had spent years helping build a future that rarely included my name. Then I remembered the envelope. I opened it carefully. Inside was a handwritten letter, along with an invitation. The letter was short, only a few sentences, but I read it twice, then 3 times. The company was launching a new mentorship program for young leaders, and they wanted me to help design it. Not Richard, me. At the bottom of the page, one sentence stood out. We would be honored to finally give credit where it belongs. Tears filled my eyes. Not because of the opportunity, because of the timing. At 68 years old, I had assumed many doors were behind me. Apparently, I was wrong. Some doors don't close. They simply wait for the right moment to open. That afternoon, I stood beside the kitchen window and watched the sunlight fill the room. For decades, I believed my best years were the years I spent helping others succeed. Now I understood something different. Those years had never been wasted. They had shaped who I was. And for the first time, I was ready to step forward as that person. Not Richard's wife. Not someone's helper. Not the woman in the background. Margaret Thompson. And that was finally enough.